I'd have to say it's the hardest thing that you'll do. Descend from 2,000 feet and gently touch the wheels down on the runway. Well, it doesn't have to be hard. One fellow student, back when I was learning, spent 16 lessons, 16 lessons in the plane trying to do smooth landings. He couldn't get it. You would never be signed off for your first solo flight unless you can land properly. He spent the money to go up in a rented plane with an instructor 16 times. Now that's a waste of money. The simulator would have been useful to practice the skill of it, the procedure of it, the checklist of it, and the numbers, and make sure things are right, and the real plane to confirm the practice. Some students have quit flying lessons at this stage for cost, time, and frustration reasons. It doesn't have to be that way. We have already learned to slow our plane down when we practice different airspeeds. We also learned to control our descent to a lower altitude. This was on purpose, knowing we will need both skills to land our airplane. So this shouldn't be hard. And we're not stressing that we might hit the runway. We're in a simulator. We have the added benefit of saving our flight before we start the descent. Then we can reset it again and again and again to practice the descent and landing until we grease it. Have you ever heard that term? This term means we slide onto the runway with no big bump when we touch down. Passengers love this, and they'll judge a pilot on their ability to grease the landing. So we need to get from here to there as slow as possible without stalling. All right, remember, we're going to go real slow and descend. This is the tricky part. Too many people point the nose to the runway and are surprised when the speed increases. Way too much. Then they pull up at the runway and they balloon way up and they lift from that speed. Then they point the nose to the runway to get down quick and they bounce again. And then they, oh my gosh. Let's do this controlled and slow. Now our normal speed range has a VS with flaps up and power off of 51 knots. That's our stall speed, remember, 51 knots. Although we need to learn to land without flaps in the event that they're not working, but you need rudder pedals to do that. So we'll cover that in an intermediate course. So where we learn performance landings and takeoffs, including a flapless approach and land, and crosswind landings. We'll do all of that in an intermediate course. So we'll be using flaps here, which is a normal approach for all landings, as it affords us a slower approach speed, a controlled descent speed, and a better visibility of the runway as we go in. The VSO, or stall speed with flaps lowered, is 47 knots, even lower, so we can go slower and have a good visibility of the runway. Each model of the 172 could be different. So we never want to get within a few knots of this. But in real flying, it is common to hear the stall horn for the whole rollout on the runway. So you're close to stalling, but touching down and rolling out. I've even seen a demonstration of how to keep the stall horn sounding the whole landing. That's dangerous, this close to the ground. No room for error. That was just showing off to show they know how to use the plane properly. So we'll keep the speed up above the stall speed and keep it constant. Although there are many trains of thought about this, it's common to control speed with the nose of the airplane, which is pitch, and then control the descent speed with power. This means how fast or slow you descend. But we will visually use the runway to judge this and adjust. If you use this plan, you will have perfect landings every time. Well, near perfect. I still have to adjust, all right? Pitch controls speed, power controls descent. The first action to take to know when to initiate the descent. We're flying at 2,000 feet, and we will start our descent once we pass the smokestack. That smokestack is called the Hearn stack. It's not used anymore, but it's a hydro generating plant. And generates electricity, and they haven't fired that up in years. The black soot of coal, right? That smokestack is still there, and it's a landmark. So we'll pass the smokestack at 2,000 feet, and we'll have our runway in sight, although it's quite far away still. We still have over a mile to line up with the runway and fine-tune our descent. We're headed for runway 26, up there on that thin strip of runway. If we wait too long, the runway will be way down there, and we can't get there without diving straight down. We don't want to do that. If we are impatient and we descend too soon, the runway is hard to see, and it's way up there. So we have to power up and fly to the runway. This isn't healthy, as you could lose power, or you could have lots of turbulence, or even obstacles in the way. They call this powering to the airport at low altitude. They call this scud running. When you stay under the radar and power through at low altitude, it's not healthy at all. The distance estimate. To know when to descend will be a visual one, as you have seen, but it's also a mathematical one. And this applies to the circuit too. In the next module, in the circuit, at a half mile from the runway, we should be at 500 feet above the airport altitude. So we should be at 750 feet because the altitude of the runway is 250. You get it? So at 1 mile from the runway, we should be at 1,000 feet above the airport elevation, or 1,250 feet on the altimeter. So the correct angle to descend is when you're 1 mile out and 1,250 feet high. Well, we can't measure 1 mile out so exact as that. So we use the visual out the window to see how the runway looks. Then we adjust to get the right look. As in the second visual here, before we can pitch the nose down and aim at the runway, we need to slow down and apply flaps. Do you remember how to slow down? We reduce the engine RPM but keep the pressure on the yoke to maintain the altitude. So we do this ahead of the spot where we wish to descend. We bleed off our speed, so we need some time to slow the plane down. Apply the flaps and establish the descent speed. So we throttle back to a low RPM, let's say 1,500 for now. Eventually you could even be at idle. In older planes, we have to apply carb heat. We haven't talked about that because we have the newer planes here. We could even throttle back to idle and establish everything, then add some power if needed. So, it's variable here, but we're doing it, we'll throttle back some. The nose will want to drop from this reduced RPM. Hold the yoke and correct for this and keep the nose level to lose some speed. You should notice the airspeed indicator slowing to within the white range. Once you're in the white range, lower 10 degrees of flap. That's the first notch. This will pitch the nose down a little, but hold back to slow even more. Now lower to 20 degrees, one more notch of the flaps. This is the second stop on the flap switch. This is the normal flaps setting for a landing. We want to slow our plane to 65 to 70 knots. This is well above stall speed, but slow enough to roll out when we land. As you refine your landings, you can experiment with your landing speed. So you adjusted the pitch with the yoke and the nose of the plane to establish your speed, probably with your left hand while you do the throttle with your right. We should be pointing down toward the airport now. We have to get our plane lined up with the runway now, like this. Now we line up with the runway. Imagine the red line. Let's draw a red line there, running from the far end of the runway through your airplane. Is the line off to the right? Is it off to the left? You have to correct with the yoke or the pedals and minor corrections. We'll use the yoke in the beginner course to get you lined up. Well, actually, we'll bank the plane. You'll see planes do this. Once we're lined up, let's focus back on our descent speed. Is it still the same? Here's the secret to landings. We will put that runway threshold, or the starting point of that runway, with the numbers in the lower center part of our windscreen, like this. All the way down to the runway. We will keep it on our windscreen in this position, making corrections for our direction and also making sure our descent speed stays the same. Our descent speed was established with our yoke. Once we pitch the plane to the right speed, we don't have to do that part. We just have to correct for alignment and use our throttle to correct for descent speed. All right? So what do we do now? How do we make corrections? How does this line up? All right? So we're going to keep that runway on our windscreen in that same position, just over that dashboard. We're going to keep it there. How do we do that? Well, that's the challenge, right? So if the runway seems to move up the screen, you're going to fall short of the runway. You're going to land where you're looking. If that runway is moving up the screen, don't you see water? You're going to land in that water. all right? You'll fall short of the runway. If the runway seems to move down and even out of view, you will land long or further down the runway, or even on the other side of the airport. You will land where you look. How do you control this movement of the runway up or down? Power. Remember that increased power is increased lift. And as the plane lifts, the runway will fall back down to the lower part of the screen. Now reduce the power to just above what you had it to try and keep that runway there. Keep your hand on the throttle for the descent all the way down in case you have to abort and give it full power. We also keep our hand on the throttle to make the minor adjustments to power for keeping the runway in sight. You'll hear it when you do commercial landings too. Oh, listen, the engine's going up. Oh, it's coming back a bit. Resist the urge to use your yoke to pull up or push down. You will only increase your airspeed and bounce or decrease your airspeed and stall. Only use your yoke to adjust airspeed if it isn't right or your bank left or right to line up. That's all we're doing with it. At this point, it should be minor adjustments in any area. If you reduce power even by 100 RPM, you'll notice the nose drop a bit. Less lift, and the runway comes back into view. Now try to maintain that look with power alone. Once trimmed to keep that descent speed, and you have adjusted power to keep the runway numbers not moving on your windscreen, you should be able to descend all the way down to the runway threshold without touching anything or very minor adjustments. That's the challenge. Now, what if it all goes wrong? It's going to happen, especially the first few times. So if at any time it's going all wrong, as it may the first few times, give it full power, pull back a little bit. Don't yank it all the way back. You could stall, right? You're already going slow, all right? So give it full power, pull back a little bit to establish straight and level, raise the flaps one notch at a time. Raise it 10 degrees, make sure it's in positive climb, raise it 10 degrees, make sure it's positive climb. As the plane accelerates and establishes a climb indication, raise the next notch of flaps until you're finally clean, meaning you have raised the flaps and full power and you're climbing. This is called pulling up and going around. Now, we don't know the circuit yet, so once you establish your positive climb, reset the flight back to the control zone approach and try again, all right? It's a taste of what you would do if things go wrong, all right? You and I can simply go back and reset the flight and start again. Let's do it right. No, let's start again and do it as many times as you need for free. So let's say it's going all wrong and you don't need to execute a missed approach. Let's say we do that. So let's land as we get closer to the runway. As I mentioned before, all right, so we're going to continue on now and let's land as we get closer. So I mentioned before, we'll land where you're looking. As you stare at those threshold numbers and aim for them, we have to eventually change something so we don't crash. I'm heading towards the numbers, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. At what time do I pull? All right, that's the thing that we have to figure out. Now in a real plane, there's a lot of clues, both visual and in your senses. You're feeling the sinking feeling. You're getting a peripheral out the windows. You're actually seeing that you're sinking to the ground, and you will pull up. All right, we have to use pretty much, and especially in this course, we have a single screen in front of us, and we've got to use that to figure out when to do the flare, when to pull up so we don't hit the ground. All right, and that's a hard thing to do in the simulator. We don't have all the senses to work with. So when we get so close that the numbers fall under the nose of the plane, the secret is to simply look up to the horizon at the far end of the runway. Don't look up a few feet. Don't look up halfway down the runway. Look to the horizon. That's the secret. And that was the final secret that finally broke it for the person trying 16 times. They finally looked to the horizon, not to the runway. All right? So you look up to the horizon at the far end of the runway, and we pull back on the yoke to level off the plane to a level attitude, or even a bit nose high. As you know from airspeed practice, when you try to establish straight flight with no power, your descent rate will increase, your speed will drop, and you'll stall the plane. Well, we're trying to stall the plane on touchdown. We are flaring a few feet or even 20 feet above the runway. Those who grease their landings are even less. So you look ahead at the horizon, bring the nose there, and you will eventually touch your wheels on the runway. Your plane will eventually touch the runway. just from your descent rate. Keep holding back. Keep that nose wheel off the runway while traveling so fast. As your speed bleeds off and you slow down, your nose wheel will settle onto the pavement, and this time you can steer it off the runway in a slow enough descent. Exiting the runway. So this would be exciting at this part. I mean, your first landing and you didn't crash, or this is your first successful landing after many attempts. As your speed continues to diminish, you will turn to your right onto the taxiway. On good landings, you're slow enough to exit on taxiway Foxtrot. But if you're still too fast, apply brakes and slow enough to exit on 15 or even exit at the end of the runway on taxiway Alpha. Porter Airlines Dash 8 taxi off Alpha as they need the whole 4,000 feet to slow enough to exit. They could do a short field landing and try for sooner, but it makes passengers a little uncomfortable. As you exit onto the taxiway, use some throttle if you have to, but go slowly. Right? You will stop after the holding short line. Clear of the runway and do your clear of active runway checklist. This is a legal requirement. We got to get past that line. If you don't cross the lines before you stop, you are legally still on the runway, and the tower can't clear others to take off or land. Now, the landing runway would always be into wind. Although we took off on 08 and eventually landed on 26, this is probably something that wouldn't be done unless there's no wind or the wind changed. Maybe ATIS told us that the wind changed. All right, it could happen. We do it here for simplicity to focus on landing without the details of the circuit. It's very overwhelming for a lot of people to learn to land and the circuit. Lots to do in the circuit, so let's get this straight-in approach mastered. There will be times they give us a straight-in clearance, and we'll handle it well. Lesson 2, summary and homework. Pitch controls speed. Power controls descent. Always use flaps to keep airspeed low. Get that perfect runway visual out your windscreen. Flare before you hit the runway and bleed off your speed. Clear the runway before stopping.